Showing feedback. Let's talk about it. Because earlier this week, I asked a question on Facebook about who leaves showing feedback. Do you, yes or no? And why or why not? Because this is a hot topic that I feel like gets a little bit heated at times and people have very strong feelings about it. And I got quite a few really interesting responses, and people came in and chimed in with the yes or no and the why or why not and some of their concerns about it. And so yesterday, the day after that, I asked this follow-up question, and I looked into the responses and why people had some concerns about it. But I was curious, how has showing feedback made a difference in selling listings? And again, got a number of really good just comments and discussion and feedback about people sharing stories where they were able to use some sort of discussion after a showing to perhaps make a deal work. But it didn't get rid of the idea that some people have concerns, and there were a number of concerns that kept showing up, namely things like fair housing. They were worried that can showing feedback lead to a potential fair housing violation when maybe the feedback leads towards a seller making a decision based on, a protected class, something along those lines. One was negotiating leverage. There's certainly a concern that if we share all this information about our feedback, could that perhaps then compromise our negotiating position in some way? Because if we let the seller know that we love the house, could that potentially make them say, oh, well, let's just ask for more money, something along those lines. Another one that came up is about confidentiality, right? That who are we getting the feedback from? Is it the realtor's feedback? Is it the buyer's feedback? And if we share that information without approval from the buyer, are we potentially violating confidentiality? And then the last thing that I heard a number of times is that, feedback for the most part after showings generally isn't very helpful. A lot of people don't use any sort of custom questions on feedback forms. It's just sort of generic questions that aren't going to be very helpful, so I don't leave feedback. And one that does pop up that I want to address today in particular is really in line with that idea of buyer representation, confidentiality, and it's this idea of buyers suing their agent over leaving feedback that compromises their negotiating position. Okay, that's really one that's at the heart of what I want to talk about today, because we've seen this idea before, right? That somebody got sued, a buyer got mad because a seller found out information from feedback and they were upset about it, and that hurt the buyer in their negotiation. And so that led to them suing their agent over it, and the agent perhaps losing that lawsuit. I've heard that story for years, and I really wanted to track it down and see if I could figure out what actually happened in that case. So I've done a significant amount of research to try to run this down. I want to share that with you today, and more broadly talk about feedback and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think you get to decide that. And if you want to leave feedback or ask for it or not, all those sorts of things, that's completely up to you. But I do want to talk about the issues around it so that at least we are not talking in hypotheticals and are more talking about what we can see from perhaps the real world of what has and hasn't happened. So when it comes to feedback, we see things like these stories, right? This story on Real Estate News where this gentleman's saying that, look, it's an outdated professional courtesy. And of course, he in this article here, he's advocating for more technological use of instead of feedback, using things like whatever Real Scout is to test the market, and using analytics and heat maps and social media campaigns and AI algorithms, and that those things are more useful than what he described as, simply put, it is that feedback is an old habit that has no upside except for the sensibilities of old timers who are still blurring the lines between representation and cooperation. I thought that was kind of interesting. Sensibilities of old timers. Well, that's one person's perspective, but we see these sorts of articles. We see in education classes, people get taught, hey, don't leave feedback. And some of this centers around this idea that your buyer could sue you because there are examples of this happening. Now, I ran this down. I've done research for months over time trying to figure out where did this story originate. I think I might have found two places where it originated. Neither of those can I find any actual support for a real lawsuit. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm not saying an agent or a broker did not get sued. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just telling you, I can find absolutely no evidence that it actually happened. Just some people on social media saying it happened. So let's take a look at where this, I think, originated. Okay. The most recent is back in 2024. This reel started circulating and went pretty viral and got shared around. So let's take a look at it real quick.
A realtor that got sued for providing their buyers feedback after a home showing. Well, sellers often get frustrated when the agents don't share feedback on their home, but this may explain why. The buyer initially said the house was overpriced and in poor condition, so the agent shared this feedback with the seller's agent. A few days later, the buyer changed their mind and made an offer below the list price. The seller countered at full price and the buyer accepted, but during the inspection period, the buyer requested repairs and the seller refused. They said, take it or leave it. And at closing, the seller explained they were difficult because of the negative feedback. The buyer then sued their agent for violating their fiduciary duty and won.
So stories like this then translated into other people sort of tagging on because they see that it makes some they get some, traction with it. And so now we see something like this.
We'll hate hearing this, but buyer's agents should never give feedback after a showing, ever. I mean, only if they want to get sued and screw over their buyers. This story is freaking nuts, but agents need to pay attention. Shannon Gillette out in Queen Creek, Arizona, told this story on Instagram of this agent who got sued by their clients. But here's where it gets tricky. The buyer's agent told the seller something that made them mad.
Okay. I tried to find this. Shannon, if you see this and you can give me a citation to the actual case, please do. If anybody watching this can send me the actual case where this happened, because court cases are generally public record. And I have scoured the internet. I have looked specifically in Arizona. I have pulled up legal research tools that, because I am an attorney, caveat, I'm not your lawyer, but I have used legal research tools to try to find a case, anything that supports this being a real story, and I cannot find it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. That does not mean it didn't happen. But oftentimes big cases like this that can be profound on something that is pervasive across the industry, the idea of leaving feedback, and something happens where somebody gets sued and loses, usually you can find that in other places. You can find it on Realtor Association websites where they write a blog post about it. You can find it on NAR's website where they post about important litigation that happens. And you can find it somewhere. I can find nothing that supports this actually happening anywhere around this time period of 2024 or otherwise that shows that this is a real thing that actually happened. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I just want to be crystal clear about that because it very well might have. But if it did, as best I can tell, it's something that maybe a lawsuit was filed, but there's no appellate decision. This didn't go up to a state Supreme Court. They didn't actually litigate the case. Perhaps it got filed and then they settled the case. It doesn't mean that they lost. It doesn't mean that a court ruled against anybody. And so as best I can tell, I think it's more likely a hypothetical than a real case. Now, I cannot guarantee that, but if it's a real case, it's a real case. Has there been throughout time buyers suing their agents over leaving feedback? And the answer is there's zero evidence to support that. Now, I kept digging, and as best I could tell, the origination of this idea, the farthest back I could trace it was 2007, where there was this blog post by Vicky Watzlawick. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation there, but she tells a story of a local agent here, another office not hers, being sued over a feedback issue. And in this case, she says that the feedback was that the buyer's agents said that the buyer thought the colors were tacky, and the listing agent passed that on to their agent. A week goes by, the buyers can't find another home, and so they come back, and the sellers are the same people, and they recognize these are the same people that said that it was tacky. And so what happened? Well, they ended up doing this same thing of full asking price because they're upset. The buyers were okay with it until they get to the closing table. And the seller's attorney says that the sellers requested full price because they were really upset about the tacky color comment. Now, this is the exact same story that we saw in that Shannon Gillette reel. It's just slightly different. It's a slightly different take on this exact case. And so I ran this down. Again, this was in Illinois, and I did everything I could to search Illinois, and I couldn't find any reference to it aside from that one blog post. Again, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying I cannot find any evidence that it actually happened. I cannot find a citation to a court case. I can't find any appellate decisions or published opinions or anything. If anybody has a citation to it to show me that case, I would love to see it. Because what I want to be able to do is take this information that we have and say, what are the best practices in leaving feedback if you want to, right? Or should we legitimately stop doing feedback because there is a real legitimate risk because buyers are in fact suing their agents? If buyers are in fact suing their agents, then yes, we should consider not doing feedback anymore. But if it's something that happened once in another state with completely different laws, that we don't show actually was litigated to an ultimate conclusion and perhaps they settled for a little bit of money to make it go away, is that something that we should take as precedent for how we should operate our business? And my position is no. I don't think that we should make our decisions across the entire industry based on this hypothetical, as best I can tell, perhaps one, maybe two cases that have ever existed anywhere. I don't think that should dictate how we handle our business today. And so am I a fan of feedback? Irrelevant. I don't really care one way or the other, to be honest. I know a lot of people have strong feelings about it, but I want you to have strong feelings about it for the right reasons. The idea that this story is pervasive that goes on of buyers suing their buyer's agent, as far as I can tell, is not something that is supported by real evidence out there. I think it's more of urban legend and myth than it is reality. But even with urban legend and myth, is there some things that we should learn from them in terms of how we should do feedback if we're going to? And the answer is absolutely. So when we go back to, my questions that I would ask about what are the things that concerned people and things like fair housing, confidentiality, negotiating leverage, and feedback that isn't generally useful, those are real issues. And we do need to be careful so that we don't cross boundaries on things that we should not. So let's think about this. One issue being a fair housing risk. Well, we can control for that, where the feedback, if we are going to provide it, should be about the property. It should be about the physical structure of the property. It could be about pricing, but it should not be about issues that are about demographics, about people, about who the right buyer is. Those are the things that start to cross us over into fair housing world. Those are things that should not be a part of feedback, right? It should be if there is some issue with the property that you could leave constructive feedback on, great, by all means do that. But anything that crosses over into protected classes or that starts to walk us down that path, we should absolutely avoid from leaving that feedback or soliciting that kind of feedback of some question like, who do you think is the best type of buyer for this property? That's not a question we should be asking because that's the type of thing that absolutely leads us into the vicinity of fair housing and gets pretty problematic as we continue to go down that path. The other issue is buyer representation confidentiality, and that's absolutely an issue as well. We 100% cannot disclose in any circumstances confidential information. And if you're in Oklahoma, confidential information is specifically defined. Our Broker Relationship Act says that confidential information is the following four things, and those shall be the only things considered confidential in a transaction. That a party is willing to pay more or accept less. The motivating factors for why a party is buying or selling. That they're willing to agree agree to different financing terms than what's being offered, and anything else specifically designated as confidential. In the state of Oklahoma, those are the only things considered confidential in a transaction. So certainly we should not be disclosing any of that information. Now, other states have different laws. If you practice in an agency state where you are under the law of agency and you have actual legal fiduciary duties, and maybe you have a different definition of confidentiality, in which case you need to know that. And then if you are going to leave feedback or you're going to solicit feedback, we are not soliciting or leaving feedback that violates those boundaries of confidentiality. And perhaps should we get permission from our buyers to leave feedback? Maybe. Maybe that's a good practice that we have that conversation with them up front so that we say, look, there's a practice in the industry where listing agents will often ask for feedback. They will ask for some general questions. And so we can discuss that if you are willing to leave that feedback. And, that sometimes is helpful for them to then go back to their seller and figure out how to get the house in a more appropriate manner for somebody else to come buy it, perhaps. You just never know. And we certainly have seen when I asked those questions, a lot of people who said feedback was valuable in helping get the house sold. So maybe we make it buyer's choice. Do they want to do that? But that leads us into the third issue people were concerned about, which is legitimate, and that is our negotiating position. So should we leave feedback that could come back to haunt us and gives away our negotiating position or offends the seller or makes it realize that, we're just absolutely in love with the house, so they drive a harder bargain? Of course not. Absolutely not. And so perhaps when it comes time to leave feedback, we have to have in the back of our mind that the buyer could wake up tomorrow and change their mind, or a week from now change their mind. And anything that we say that could harm our negotiation position is absolutely something that we should be very cautious about. And for the things that could offend a seller, well, we certainly don't want to leave any feedback that's not objective, that's not, that's offensive. I heard some stories from people saying that they would give feedback that is kind of offensive or, talks down about things. And maybe we shouldn't do that either. And so we need to be very objective and very neutral about the feedback that we leave if we're going to do it. And the last issue is feedback not being helpful. And I understand that's always going to be an issue. And look, on the other side, I know for listing agents who like feedback, it can be valuable. But, the buyer's agent, they might have looked at 8 different houses and they might have forgotten, or it's just everybody's busy. And we're all so stressed out and busy, and things are moving so fast that time to actually sit down and leave feedback is valuable time. And so perhaps people don't leave feedback. And you know what? That's okay. At the end of the day, if we're going to leave feedback, do it in the right way, be constructive, be neutral, don't give away confidential information or your negotiation position. And if you aren't going to leave feedback, that's okay too. And on the listing side, I know that some of us love and value feedback. But we have to respect that everybody gets to decide in their own business how they do business. And so should we be doing feedback? I don't think it's a question of whether we should or that we shouldn't. I think that the idea that buyers are going to sue their agent over feedback is infinitesimally small and unlikely. And I'm not even convinced at this point that it has ever actually happened. If it has happened, maybe 1 or 2 cases, maybe, in the whole country of all the feedback that's ever been left. Listen, there's risk in everything that we do. And so you have to decide if you're okay with that risk. But if you're going to leave feedback, do it in the right way. If you're not going to leave feedback, that's cool too. You get to decide. And if we're listing properties and you want to ask for feedback, by all means do it. And try to ask questions that actually lead to constructive information and feedback that comes. But if somebody doesn't leave feedback, listen, that's okay. They get to decide that. They get to run their business in the way that they want to. And if it's their policy that they've decided they don't leave feedback, totally fine. We just have to respect that. So everybody decide for yourself, but do it with open eyes, knowing how to do it correctly and not in a way that does cause us a negotiation problem, a fair housing problem, or something else. But also don't do it out of just pure fear that something bad could happen. Instead, learn how to do it the correct way. And if you want to leave feedback, make it helpful and constructive. And if you don't, totally cool. That's up to you. But I hope this was helpful, at least in maybe busting a little bit of a myth. And if anybody out there actually has a citation to a case where a buyer actually sued their seller, their buyer's agent over listing feedback, please send it my way and I will do a follow-up video covering that case in detail. But until then, I'm not sure it's actually happened.